This is just a little snippet left over from last week, and didn't have time to put it up last week. It's short, but it's something that I want to cover. I want to talk about Scheichen and Egley's heuristic systemic model. And what you're going to notice is that it is really similar to elaboration likelihood theory. So one of the reasons I'm actually kind of happy I didn't get this up last week and I'm getting it up this week is it is going to kind of reinforce and review elaboration likelihood theory. Remember that there's been a huge amount of research that has come out of elaboration likelihood theory, extending things, asking more questions, looking at things in more depth, and that's part of what we're going to do over the next couple of weeks. So the heuristic systemic model is an extension of elaboration likelihood theory. It's really similar, but there's a few other things that are added in. So let me show you what that is. So Scheichen and Egley noticed that some people in listening to persuasion, in processing messages, in being the target of somebody else's persuasion, sometimes do systematic processing, which is pretty much the same as central route processing. We put some intellectual labor into understanding the message, we put some work into making sense of it, and we work to think critically. Maybe it's a biased processing or an unbiased processing, but either direction, we're working at thinking critically to make sense of a message that has been presented to us, and that's pretty much the same as central route processing. Scheichen and Egley also hypothesized that some people do what they called heuristic processing. And that's pretty much the same as peripheral route processing, just with a different name. So there's not a lot new to learn here. They're just putting these ideas together in a somewhat different way. A heuristic is an analytic model, a decision-making model. It's a shortcut in some ways. So, for example, think about a couple of characteristics of a good restaurant. If you were judging a book by its cover and just kind of looking at a restaurant, what sorts of things would you use to decide whether it was a good place that you wanted to eat and give a try? By the way, this is a game that I play with my other half all the time called Restaurant Roulette. And the rules are you must judge the book by the cover. And once you've decided to actually go into the restaurant, you must eat the entire meal there. You cannot leave. And we've run into some fabulous places, and we've also had some horrible experiences. But we call it Restaurant Roulette. It's fun. Try it sometime. So if you were doing that, right, if you were playing Restaurant Roulette, what would you look for? What sorts of things would help you kind of decide, oh, this is good, or no, it isn't a place that I want to go to? Would the health department letter hanging in the window have something to do with that? Would the lighting of the restaurant, whether it was bright or dark, have something to do with that? What about the number of people that are already in the restaurant? Is it crowded? Is it really crowded? Is it moderately crowded? Is it empty? What would that do? What other things might influence you? Colors, wording, maybe the location. There might be all sorts of things. Now, all of this would be things that maybe you kind of look at the restaurant, you just kind of take in, you don't think a lot about, you don't do any real heavy analysis. It's not like you're going out and researching the restaurant and comparing and contrasting professional reviews of the restaurant from 14 different sources and looking for similarities and differences. You're not doing any of that stuff. You're just kind of looking at it and saying, yep, we want to go in there. Nope, we don't want to go in there. You're kind of using a heuristic. You're using a set of cues, a set of factors. You're using a set of criteria to kind of quickly decide, is this a good restaurant or not? So that's kind of like peripheral route processing, but what Scheichen and Egley were getting at is a little more than that. They were looking at how humans have a tendency to create these heuristics to make decisions about things. So rather than thinking really critically about whether a job candidate is someone who has the skills and abilities to do a job well. A human resources manager might use some kind of heuristic, and they might be aware of those, or they might not be aware of those. And this is one of the reasons why you will get systemic bias, racial bias, gender bias built into hiring practices. And the person that's doing the hiring, for example, if you have a human resources manager who's doing the hiring, may not even be aware that that bias exists. So folks kind of develop these heuristics. They don't often pay a whole lot of attention to where the heuristic came from. They just sort of use it as a shortcut. And if you're hiring engineers, and if in your head is kind of this model of engineers are male, engineers are relatively young, engineers are white folks, there may not be an outward intentional active bias against a group of people, but that doesn't mean that the bias doesn't exist. In fact, it very much exists at a level the person that's engaging in that bias doesn't think about as much. So sometimes heuristic processing is really useful. Sometimes it helps us quickly pick a restaurant or make a decision about what we're going to do or how we should study for a class or whether we should buy a product. And sometimes it doesn't matter and it works really well and it's easy and it helps us out and it makes things more efficient. And sometimes it's a huge problem. Sometimes heuristic processing means that we're making decisions without really thinking about the criteria for that decision. We're kind of allowing it to happen. And with things like racial bias in hiring, the person doing it gets to think, well, I'm not a bigot. I'm doing the right thing. I don't judge people based on X, Y, or Z characteristics, but they are. They're just not aware of it. And heuristics are very powerful in making that happen because it's part of a natural, normal process of saving mental energy and making sense of the world. It's a lot of work to do systematic processing or central route processing, and so we often kind of fall back on heuristic processing to be able to not drive ourselves nuts and be overwhelmed by the world. But unless we're really examining those heuristics, that becomes a problem. So something that I think is particularly important in the business world these days is to really look for unconscious bias in what you do, right? And that's because heuristic processing is something we naturally do, but also means we may not be aware of problematic decisions that we make in terms of what persuades us and what doesn't persuade us. So Scheichen and Egley noticed that sometimes systematic processing happens, sometimes heuristic processing happens. They hypothesized that there could be simultaneous processing. Now, if you go back to the elaboration likelihood model, that model very clearly says either you're going through the central route or you're going to the peripheral route. It's one or the other. And I think it was right of Scheichen and Egley to ask the question, well, is it possible to use both? Is it possible to use both at the same time? And there was at least some initial research, some initial experimental evidence, some initial social scientific evidence that says this might happen. But for the most part, there hasn't been research that's held that up. What most research seems to indicate is folks either go down the systematic processing route or they go the heuristic processing route, and they're usually not doing both simultaneously. It tends to be one or the other. So that's one of the things that helps us do good social science. We ask questions, we test them out, we look at initial results, we test them further, and then we use that as real evidence for drawing the conclusions that we draw. So I think it was great that Scheichen and Egley asked that question. And I think this is a good example of how theories are developed in the social sciences. They really believe that they should be finding simultaneous processing, but there hasn't been a lot of evidence that that actually happens in real life. Scheichen and Egley also talked about the sufficiency principle, and I think this is an important addition to how we're looking at persuasion. Scheichen and Egley found in, again, a lot of research and good, solid social scientific research, that a sufficiency principle exists, that people tend to make decisions by getting as much information as they think they need, and then they stop, right? I do this whenever I've bought a new computer. I do research. I look into what might be best and meet my needs, and what gets me the most processing power for the most reasonable price. And then I buy something, and then I stop. I don't gather any more information. I quit at that point. Mainly because I know that if I gather more information, I'm going to find something else that confuses me or makes the decision harder, or may tell me that I made a bad decision or whatever else. And so it's easier just not to gather any more information. That may not be the best way to make a decision about things, but we know people do that. We know for the most part, once people feel like they have as much information as they need, they stop at that point and become resistant to additional information. Think about how this applies to all sorts of things. Think about how this applies to consumer behavior, what people buy. Consumer behavior is what folks on the buying end of our economy do or don't do. But also think about that in terms of politics, political decisions, how people think about policies, how people think about political candidates, and how those decisions are made. And I think the sufficiency principle is especially important. Once somebody has made a decision and feel that they have enough information, they do tend to become resistant to any additional information. And I think that's in part a defensive thing. People don't like to be wrong. It's also an efficiency thing. People don't like to waste energy on something that isn't necessary. And so you put those two things together, and this becomes pretty powerful. It means if you want to change somebody's mind, that becomes a really tough thing to do. It means that if somebody's trying to change your mind, they could do it, but they've got a huge obstacle to overcome in terms of the sufficiency principle. So this is pretty much what I wanted to bring up with Scheichen and Egley's heuristic systemic model. It's not a huge development over and above elaboration likelihood theory, but in terms of heuristic processing, simultaneous processing, and the sufficiency principle, I think it adds some nice things and some important things into our understanding of persuasive processes. And a little side note here, while I've got you, pretty soon you're going to be getting instructions for your first persuasive analysis paper, and you're going to be asked to pick some kind of pure persuasion artifact. We'll talk more about that. And you're also going to pick a theory that helps us better understand that particular artifact and draw some conclusions. Now, you might be tempted to go with elaboration likelihood theory, and you could go that direction. But I want you to also consider other models and theories that I am talking about or will be talking about. So you could definitely probably write that entire paper and that entire analysis simply talking about Scheichen and Egley's heuristic systemic model and narrowing it down even further by looking at the sufficiency principle, for example. So even if you pick Scheichen and Egley's heuristic systemic model, that doesn't mean that you have to use everything in the entire theory. With something like this model, you might be able to do that. But you don't necessarily need to do it. If the idea of heuristics and unconscious bias is especially important to you, then you could really focus in on that particular topic. Go find some sources that are published, learn a little more about that, look at what Scheichen and Egley said about it, look at other research that has been done, and develop around that particular concept. The same is true if you decide to go with elaboration likelihood theory. There's a very similar thing. You could simply look at how an artifact does things to push people into peripheral route processing. Well, that's sort of what you were doing last week with looking at home shopping and how the cues push people into prefer processing. Very much what you were doing there is what you're going to be doing in this upcoming paper. So the other thing to mention is you have already engaged in some practice doing exactly what your first paper is going to be. In watching home shopping and discussing that on the discussion boards, you're doing an informal version. With this upcoming paper, you're going to do a formal version of that exact process, cite sources, do a little more depth of analysis, and write it up that way. But it shouldn't be anything that is all that different from what you have already seen done and what you've already engaged in. Just a little bigger, a little better, a little more thoughtful, a little more formal, and with cited references. And so I wanted to preview where you were going with that paper. All right. So I hope that works, and as soon as possible, I'm going to have more stuff down below this video for you to take a look at. It might be a little slow in getting stuff up this week, but I will get it up as soon as possible, and I think you'll have plenty to do. All right. Hope you're having a great week. See you in a little while.